Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of the Pure Kino podcast. I am joined today by Chris from Vlogging Through History. He is known for his reaction videos to other historians on YouTube, as well as his original content, where he goes to historical sites here in the US and shows us around through history. So, thank you so much for being here, Chris.
Thank you, Kino. I'm excited. This is the first of two podcasts I'm actually doing interviews for this week. This is new to me, so you get to be my very first one.
Awesome. It's an honor. Yeah, I know there's a lot of people starting, podcasts or YouTube channels. I know mine got started really because of COVID and just, looking for a project to do. And it's cool to see just an outgrowth of like new content to enjoy. Awesome. Well, let's get started here. I just wanted to start off by just asking, what's your background in history? Like, what kind of got you interested in this and turned it into almost a career basically for you?
Yeah. My background with history goes way, way back. I'm going to be 44 here in a couple of weeks. I was 8 years old when they found the Titanic in 1985. And that was actually what first got me really interested because I found myself wanting to learn everything I could about the Titanic. So I started going, this is before the internet. So I'm going to the library, getting books out, learning, and just found myself wanting to know everything I could. And then a few years later, Ken Burns had his documentary that came out about the Civil War, which is phenomenal and still even today stands up as one of the best. And I watched that whole thing, and then that began a lifelong love of the Civil War. And so by the time I got to high school, I had decided I wanted to be a history professor. That was what I was going to do with my life. And so that was what I went to school for in college. And then my life kind of just took a very different turn. And I've never actually worked as a teacher. I've subbed a few times. But for the last 8 years, I have been a speaker for an organization called Rachel's Challenge. So I travel to schools all over the country talking about kindness and compassion, sharing the story of a girl named Rachel Scott who was killed at Columbine. But I've always had history as kind of my first love, and it's something I've spent my whole life just absorbing all I could, and this has finally become an outlet for me in that.
Well, that's awesome. And in a way, you have gotten to be a history professor in the sense that like your YouTube channel reaches hundreds of thousands of people, way more than you could in a classroom. And I'm not sure about you, but really, YouTube has been a way for me to explore history in a way that is more enjoyable than a lot of my classroom experiences have been. I really did, like you, love history. It was one of my favorite subjects in school. But the way that a lot of YouTubers, a lot of the ones you react to, are able to explore it in a really engaging and exciting way, I think a lot of people are really getting interested in this subject because of the way they present it.
Yeah, I think a big part of our experiences growing up tend to be. I think it's not even so much a subject as so much as the person presenting the subject. If you have a great teacher that you connect with, then it tends to make you fall in love with that subject sometimes. And I've talked to so many people on the channel who said, I never loved history because I didn't have a good history teacher. And for a lot of people, I've kind of become that person that has helped them connect to history. And I'm very honored by that. And I think what YouTube allows is because there's so much content and there's so many different people presenting it, it allows us to find people with whom we can connect and help us to fall in love with something. And, we're all going to have, you don't get to pick who your history teacher is necessarily in high school, but you can pick which content you fall in love with on YouTube.
Absolutely. And how did you get started on YouTube? Like, what was the thing to kind of push you to want to even try that?
So it actually started out of necessity. I mentioned earlier I'm a speaker for this organization, Rachel's Challenge, and because we speak in schools, most schools want to do our events in the first couple of months of the school year. And so September, October, November, I would be on the road 5 or 6 days a week. I'd be in Alaska on Monday and Wisconsin on Wednesday. But then by January and February, everything started slowing down, and the rest of the year, I'm pretty much a stay-at-home dad. So I was looking for something to do, and so about 4.5 years ago, I started a historical strategy gaming channel, which I originally called The History Guy. Well, then a couple months after I started my channel, this other guy started a channel called The History Guy, which I don't know if you've seen his channel. History Deserves to Be Remembered. And I started getting his grew like crazy, and I started getting all these people accusing me of trying to copy off of him, and I'm like, my channel was first. So then I changed it to History Guy Gaming, and I'm still doing that. But when I was traveling for work, um, speaking in schools, and if I went somewhere near a historic site, I would just record my experience traveling there and I'd upload it to the gaming channel. But it was getting lost with all the gaming stuff. And so about a year ago, I started this channel, Vlogging Through History, as a way just to document my historic site visits. Well, right about the time I started the channel, COVID shut everything down. So I didn't travel for a year. So that was what led to the reaction videos. Somebody suggested, well, since you can't make historic site videos, why don't you react to a Sabaton song? And I'm like, who's Sabaton? So I checked them out, did a reaction. It blew up. I got 10 times the views I did from a historic site video. So then I did another one and another one. And so I started doing daily reaction content in December when I had like 300 subscribers. And within a month, I was getting 1,000 subscribers a day. And it was just crazy. And then I started getting back to doing the original content again. And now it seems like there's a nice balance of both. And it's been just really fun. The favorite part for me is just connecting with the community. I make these videos, but I get to meet all these incredible people on the internet who love history as much as I do, and help me learn something I didn't know before. So it's been great.
Well, the thing that I love about your reaction videos is I can tell that you are very knowledgeable about a lot of things you're reacting to, because you'll bring up something, like you'll pause the video and say something, and then 10 seconds later, the video will say what you, so you like preemptively thought it through. And yeah, I mean, I think it's great that we get more perspective on things like, extra history oversimplified. They make a lot of entertaining videos, but you'll add tidbits that they didn't have time to add or other things to it. And I think it's a great way to just get more like historical context around a lot of these events.
Yeah, it's funny when that happens. I Part of me like cringes a little bit, because I just can think in the back of my mind, somebody's going to think, okay, you went and watched this video ahead of time so that you would know what to say. And typically, if I have seen a video, I will say that up front. But it happens a lot like that, where I'll say something and then 10 seconds later, and that's part of the reaction. Kind of the thing with reactions is when you haven't seen it, you don't know what they're going to say, so you don't know if they're going to add something or not. So I try to preemptively add it, and then but it's fun. It's been really cool just to see all this fantastic content and have an opportunity just to add a little bit more to it.
Well, I think that not only your reactions, though, a lot of your original content, like I loved you ranking the presidents. I saw that video, and just getting a lot of different context on some of these guys who I didn't really know anything about, like Franklin Pierce. You talked about his very tragic events before he became presidency, and how that maybe contributed to him being a horrible president. I didn't know anything about that. So even things like that, just getting a lot more information about these guys has been really interesting for me.
Yeah, the way I view this stuff, whether it's the original content or the reactions, is I view it just as a springboard for having a conversation, and just something as simple as a tier maker ranking list, where I can just start ranking presidents. I can just say, okay, Franklin Pierce, and then just kind of start talking a little bit about Franklin Pierce, and in a way that maybe somebody wouldn't sit down and make a whole documentary on Franklin Pierce, but and then somebody else in the chat will say something else that maybe I didn't know, and now we've all learned a little something new, and it's just a real collaborative kind of thing. It's a lot of fun.
Well, it's great that the culture on YouTube, like a lot of people when they talk about the internet, they're kind of like cynical of like, oh, these people have no attention span, they have no interest in anything but like TikTok or video games or whatever. But your community is proof that there are a lot of people out there who are really interested in learning things in depth, and it's just maybe they didn't have a way to do that before the internet. Just being kind of like isolated groups.
There's just so much. I mean, obviously, I'm of the age that I was in college before the internet really started being a thing. So I'm young enough to be kind of internet savvy and all that stuff, but also old enough to remember the world before the internet. And people talk so much about all the negatives of the internet with social media, and granted, that's all true, and you get that as a YouTuber as well. Everybody does, but just the wealth of knowledge that we have available to us now. You know, back in the day, if I wanted to know what the capital of Bhutan was, I had to go down to the library and get a book, an encyclopedia, and look it up. Now I can grab my phone and find out in 5 seconds. And um, so it's cool to have that knowledge at our fingertips, but also be able to connect with people all over the world. Being able to hear from somebody in Serbia who tells me, I can talk about the history of what happened in Serbia in 1918, but now I can talk to somebody whose grandfather was there, and they can tell me this is what it was like as a Serbian to go through this. And, that's what's really cool about the internet, is that collaborative, being able to all share and learn together like that.
But you've done a lot of research too, particularly about the Civil War period. That's like, reading actual accounts in like libraries, things that like aren't even digitized. And I think there's a lot to be said for we when we make YouTube videos, we make things like this, we try to kind of present it in a certain way. We try to like format it in like an interesting way. But there's a lot of like firsthand accounts, like you said, details that a lot of times don't make it into documentaries or movies or any of this stuff. I think it's cool that you like have found that passion about the Civil War and like explored to that level of depth.
One great example recently, I just did a video talking about the history of John Buford, who was a cavalry commander in the Civil War, who basically chose the battlefield at Gettysburg and helped the Union win that battle. And I can share all the facts. Here's when he was born, where he lived, where he served. But what a lot of people really connected with in that video, and that taught me a lot about how to make future content, is at the end, I was doing some research and I found not only a poem that had been written in the Philadelphia Inquirer after his death, but then this statement that had been issued by his staff officers after his death. And just sharing that firsthand account, just what they said about him, that means more to most people than what I think of the guy. Because I wasn't there, I didn't know him, I didn't serve alongside him, but those guys did. And hearing what they had to say about him really connected with people. And yeah, that's one of the things, like you said, you can't necessarily get by watching a documentary. Um, I was in Washington D.C. at the National Archives. I love going to the National Archives and actually getting into people's like pension files from the Civil War. I was researching an uncle of mine who died at the Battle of Shiloh, and I opened up his pension file, and they had letters in there that he wrote home a week before the Battle of Shiloh. It was the original letter, it wasn't a copy. And his family had sent this letter into the National Archives to prove that he had been sending money home to his family. So when they claimed a pension, it was proof that they financially relied on his service. And they actually sent these letters in. So here I am holding a letter that maybe nobody had read in 150 years, with this guy talking about what it was like in camp, and how nervous they were about what they knew was going to be an upcoming fight. And that just brings history alive in a way that I don't think you can get in most ways.
And you mentioned before about Ken Burns' documentary, which is seriously one of the best historical documentaries of all time. And I think one of the successes is exactly what you're describing. He had a lot of details like that, letters from the soldiers read in their own voices, just providing a lot more detail and context to these men's lives, rather than just the big strategic details of like what day was this battle fought on, who was there, that kind of stuff.
I'll never forget when I first watched this, and to this day, I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it. There's a Sullivan Ballou, I think was his name. He was an officer who Ken Burns reads this letter that this guy wrote to his wife before the first Battle of Bull Run. And then after he reads this whole letter where this guy's talking about his love for his wife and how if I get killed, know that I'll be there with you. And then he finishes the letter by saying Sullivan Ballou was killed at the first Battle of Bull Run, July 21st, 1861. And that brings it home. And it's like, oh my gosh, this was a real person who had a widow who lost him at that battle. This wasn't, okay, this is how many men were killed at that battle. This is one guy whose family was affected forever. And it does, you're right, it brings it alive to people who maybe only heard dates and places and names growing up.
I you reminded me of that too. Like I remember that letter now. I'm getting goosebumps too. And along with this, I think that like one thing like history has a problem with is like the story aspect of it. And I know that I'm guilty of this too, which is that like I love history because it's like a narrative, it's like it's oftentimes presented like a movie where, one detail leads into the next, and maybe we're following a person like Caesar, like one character through a whole journey. Um, but like, uh, I understand like the deeper part of my brain knows that like there's a lot more to this than like, the story of one person or one nation or whatever. There's so many like socioeconomic details, like weather, disease, all these things affected. And a lot of times we kind of neglect those kind of things for like the more exciting, like, this is the story of this guy kind of thing. What are your thoughts on like history, that problem with a lot of history?
Yeah, I think that finding that connection to it. For me personally, and sometimes a lot of people joke with me about this on my channel. I mention my family tree a lot, and I mention, oh, my great 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 grandfather was at this battle. But the reason that I found family history so fascinating is, next month I'm going down to Vicksburg, and I'm going to make a bunch of videos at Vicksburg battlefield. My great 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 grandfather was in the 20th Ohio. His brigade was the first brigade to march into the city after it surrendered. For me, when I go to Vicksburg, I'm not thinking about just what was Grant doing and what was Sherman doing and what was Pemberton doing. I'm thinking this is where Corporal Samuel Hughes was standing with Company H of the 20th Ohio. And this is where he had to sleep in a trench while they were digging a mine under these Louisiana soldiers who had no idea that it was about to blow up right underneath their feet. And finding those stories that you can connect to make it more interesting to me. Because now, instead of wondering how was Grant planning this 40,000 man attack, I'm thinking, what was this individual Confederate soldier thinking when he was trying to figure out if he could catch a rat to make sure he had a little bit of meat to keep himself alive for another day? And that's the part of history you don't necessarily get taught in schools, but that's the stuff that history is really about. Vicksburg surrendered not because the Confederate troops weren't willing to fight. It was because they were starving. And, it had nothing to do with how many men there were. It had everything to do with, I don't have any food or fresh water to drink. And those, like you said, those aren't the things we think about, but those are the things that history turns on rather than the big kind of macro stuff.
Absolutely. And I think it's great that you all like you connected to your own personal family and all the history like that, because one thing I've noticed is that like you're on the East Coast, in that area, there's a lot more history there, or at least more recorded history. I'm over here in California, and it seems like just because it's such like a newer place, we don't have as many like historical sites, and like, or maybe there were, but it wasn't recorded history and things like that. So I've always been fascinated about, people who can, trace their family back to, Civil War, the American Revolution, or things like that, and how connected a lot of these things are. Like, General Lee was married to George Washington's great granddaughter, or adopted great granddaughter.
Two ways to look at it. It was his wife's great granddaughter, but it was also his adopted granddaughter because Washington's wife, Martha Washington, was married once before, and he didn't have any children with her, but she had children, and he adopted one of her grandsons as his son. And it was the grandson he adopted. His daughter was Mrs. Lee. Yeah,
It's crazy to think about like how young America is when you put it in context like that, which is that like a few generations from the revolution, we're at the Civil War. A few more generations from there, we're landing on the moon. And I've seen like accounts of people who were alive at Gettysburg Address, and then were able to see the moon landing on TV. And we really think of like history in these like set chunks where it's like, revolution, Civil War, modern day. But there are people who cross those boundaries who have lived in like 3 centuries. And we see how connected all of history is.
yeah, and like and I'm actually working on a video to do in the future where talking about the connections. I did one where I talked about the connections between the Revolution and the Civil War. I'm going to do one connecting the Civil War and World War II. Simon Buckner, who surrendered Fort Donelson to Grant, his son was the highest ranking officer killed in World War II. So you have a Civil War general whose son died on Okinawa fighting the Japanese in World War II. Just that one generation. Arthur MacArthur got the Medal of Honor charging up Missionary Ridge at Chattanooga during the Civil War, and his son Douglas MacArthur got the Medal of Honor in World War II. I mean, we are much closer connected, like you said, than we realize. That's one of the reasons why I find myself fascinated by British medieval history, for example, because here I go into a cemetery. If I see a date that says 1600s, that's old. That's about as old as it gets in America. I can go to England and go to somebody's local church that was built 1,000 years ago, and that's nothing to them. Everybody's got a building that's 1,000 years old in their town. History is relative like that. What's old to us is not what's old to them. You go to China, and stuff's much older. You go to Japan, they've got a dynasty of empire that goes back 2,600 years. Old is a very relative term for them compared to us.
Oh yeah, we've been here for like the blink of an eye. I was just at an Egyptian museum, and I was seeing things that were like 10,000 years old. Like that's how far back civilization stretched, and it kind of got me scared, even just thinking about like just the context of how far away that is from me. But when you look at just like the history of the world, it's like nothing. Like it's just a blink of an eye. We've been here.
Yeah, our lifetime is just a tiny speck in the grand scheme of things. Hey, I read something, speaking of Egypt, that I found fascinating. Maybe you've heard it before. Cleopatra lived closer to modern times than she did to the building of the pyramids. That's how long Egypt's been around and been a thing.
I've heard the expression that the ancient Egyptians were as old to the Romans as the Romans were to us. Like they looked at it as like, oh my god, this stuff is so old. Just like we would look at ancient Rome as this ancient thing. So it's crazy like just the context of like our whole human civilization. Along with that, I wanted to ask you. So I know obviously the Civil War is your favorite historical period. If I took that off the list, I took off the Revolution, I took off for fun. Let's say no Roman history. What's your what's your period are you kind of like most interested in right now besides those ones?
Right now, probably World War One, but overall, the Wars of the Roses in British medieval history is something I get. I get these streaks where I get really obsessed with something, and it's usually triggered by a documentary or a TV show that I watch. So I watched The Tudors on TV years ago, and that kicked off like this 3 year stretch where I just read everything I could about British medieval history, Henry VIII, the Wars of the Roses, which kind of led up to that. I watched Braveheart, and the next 2 months, all I did was read about William Wallace, that kind of thing. But yeah, British medieval history and World War One are two things I'm really, really fascinated by. And COVID willing, I'm gonna be visiting Western Europe next spring and visiting some of those World War One battlefields. I'm really looking forward to that. So
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that like World War I is like underrated in terms of like its historical context. And we always talk about World War II, but when you look at like all the causes of like a lot of the problems we have nowadays, they can really be traced to the events of World War I and all the problems it would spawn in like the Middle East, in Europe, communism, all the events of our lives. And I think that we haven't given it like the importance that we have like World War II.
yeah, I mean, everybody knows about World War II. World War II gets all the movies made about it and things like that. And when 1917 came out a couple years ago, everybody raved about it because we have had such a lack of good quality World War One information, documentaries, movies made, stories told about it. And there's so many great stories to be told there. And like you said, when you start learning about other areas of history, you start to realize how they're all connected. Without World War One, there is no World War Two. But without the Franco-Prussian War, there's no World War One. Without the Napoleonic Wars, there's no Franco-Prussian War, and they all you start to see the path being drawn all the way back, and how one leads to another. And like you said, World War One, without that, there's no World War Two. Without World War Two, there's no Cold War. I mean, and everything changes. And that's what's cool about history. You learn those things and you start to connect those dots, and you realize how important they all are, not just the ones that we like to talk about the most.
No, yeah, it's all connected. And um you were mentioning too before about being really interested in the Wars of the Roses. What fascinates me about English history, and I actually I visited England as well when I was in high school, and I stayed there for a
I'm
summer
jealous,
in
but go on.
Cambridge. Yeah, no, it was great. Just like I was saying before, of like the Eastern United States feels like it has more history. England feels like it has an insane amount of history. Like the college that I was staying at, one of the rooms there is where they had invented like the electric coil, and they had this like little tiny like display set up for that. And it just felt like there was so much history there. But what I found so cool about the English monarchs is it's an unbroken string of descendants from William the Conqueror and Rollo the Walker in Normandy straight through to Elizabeth today. Like, I mean, there's been like things like Cromwell has like overthrown them for a time, but their descendants still hold the throne, even though they're not the undisputed monarch. Like they don't hold all the power, but it's cool that like they're one of the most successful dynasties in our history.
Yeah, even though there's these different dynasty names, like you have the Plantagenets and the Stuarts and the Hanover dynasty, they're all family to each other. Elizabeth II, you can draw that line, like you said, right back to William the Conqueror and beyond, and that's true for everybody too. And um, it really is just a big family thing. And Queen Victoria's eldest grandson was Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was in charge of Germany when World War I started. And, so they were, and Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia were cousins, and Wilhelm and King George V were cousins, and Nicholas II and George V looked so much like each other that they could have been twins. I mean, they really just were. It was just this big family thing. And um, I guess as an American, I'm not supposed to be a monarchist, but I'm just fascinated by monarchies, probably for that reason, because of the family history involved with it.
Well, someone should have told that to Alexander Hamilton.
Exactly who I was thinking of. Hamilton would have gladly made George Washington king. A lot of other people would have too, but he was very much all about hereditary titles and things like that in America.
Well, I love that musical. Of course, it's a great, great musical. But one of the problems I had with like the reaction to it was that like it's exactly what we said before. It's completely reshaped how people perceive Hamilton, and it makes him look really good in certain areas, and downplays the things that were not so great about him. Like almost any movie or story is going to do that to an extent. But I find it funny that a lot of like really young people are like, yeah, he's one of us, but he's also like a big bank guy, and like there's a lot of things that like modern young people might not have liked about him, but the musical doesn't really cover that part of it.
Yeah, all about strong central government, all about putting all the power in the hands of a few people, and yeah, and one of the things that's one of the burdens sometimes you have with knowing a lot about a topic is sometimes it can be more difficult to enjoy something that's made for entertainment. I love Hamilton as well, and when I first heard about it, I was not a fan. I'm like, oh, what are they doing? And my daughter, who musical theater is life for her. That's what she does, and has lead in school musicals and things like that. And she's the one that got me into it. But like for example, I find myself when they get to the part of the story where you've got Aaron Burr giving Hamilton a hard time about the fact he had an affair. All I'm thinking is, but Aaron Burr, you had an affair too, and you actually had a bunch of children with one of your black slaves that you had, but they don't talk about that at all, because you're trying to create a narrative, and I get that, and I don't hold that against the folks for Hamilton because he got a whole lot more right historically than they got wrong. And it led me to want to learn more. I went and read Ron Chernow's book, which is fantastic, and that led me to read Ron Chernow's book about Grant, which was even better. And now I've got this lifelong love of Grant that I think I'll have till I die.
Absolutely. I remember too. when the creator Lin Manuel Miranda was trying to get it started before it was a play. He went to the White House and he performed the opening song, and you can tell that like people were like, "What is this? It's a rap about."
People laughed at the beginning, but then by the end, they were taking it seriously.
Yeah, and I when that before the play came out, I was in high school at the time, and I was doing the talent fair, and one of the girls I was performing with, when we were deciding what we were gonna do, she's like, "I want to do Alexander Hamilton," and she sent me the video, the White House video, and I was like, "What is this too? I don't. It's weird. I don't get it." And yeah, it just shows you how wrong you were. This is gonna be the most successful Broadway musical of all time.
Yeah, and that again shows how people can connect with history if it's packaged right. If you do it in a way that's entertaining and also informative, yeah, people have learned a lot about history because of Hamilton, and history teachers use it all the time. My son knows all about, my 8-year-old knows all about the story of the founding of our country because of Hamilton. And he knows who King George III is, and he knows about the Battle of Yorktown because it was packaged in a way that made it fun and interesting to him. And that's really the challenge we have, especially today in an age where there is so much entertainment out there and so much content out there, is to present it in a way that informs but also entertains.
And you know, another detail that the musical doesn't really address, but I found really fascinating, was Aaron Burr's life after the whole Hamilton affair, and he goes to Florida and tries to create his own little empire down there with Andrew Jackson of all people is like his right hand man who betrays him later. And I don't know, it's just so fascinating the lives these people had and the crazy things that you could get up to in an age before everything was kind of settled down and standardized and everything like that.
Yep. Yeah. Actually, here in Northeast Ohio, we always have known a little bit of the Aaron Burr story post vice presidency for him, because down on the Ohio River, there's this place called Blennerhassett Island, which was connected to Aaron Burr's plot to like basically start his own empire. So we learned about that in learning Ohio history, but didn't learn a lot about the other stuff. But I mean, just people talk about how ugly politics is now, but we had a sitting vice president shoot and kill the one of the founding fathers and not face any consequences legally for it. The stuff, we had people like John Adams saying these horrible things about Thomas Jefferson and vice versa. People throwing around words like hermaphrodite to call their political opponents things. And politics has always been ugly, and in some ways it was uglier then than it is now. And we live in an age with media where it's talked about a lot more, but it's always been that way.
Now, I hate how people are like, "Oh, life was better, back in the day, like hundreds of thousands of years ago." I mean, maybe in some ways that's true, but like, you don't realize that, hey, if your lord decides we're gonna go to war for my honor, guess what? You're going and you're gonna die for this because I said so. And the idea that the modern day has problems, of course, but to think that like to idealize and not think about the horrible things that were happening in the past is really ignorant to me.
Yeah, and you could get a simple cut and get an infection. It would kill you. There's no antibiotics to take for that. You know, we live in an age with COVID, and we're all freaking out about COVID. The Black Death goes through Europe and kills a third to one half of the entire population of the continent in a decade or less. We have it pretty good. We shouldn't forget that.
Even influenza, which they say is like the forgotten plague, was not that long ago, it was in the 1900s, and was even worse than this. And I mean, let's knock wood, but
Oh yeah, it killed like 2% of the world's population. Yeah, it was brutal.
yeah, but there's definitely things to be said for life back in the day. I think that um, there's something to the fact that you don't have as many options. People say that like the more options you have, the more likely you are to like be unsure of yourself or depressed or things like that. Whereas people back in the day were like, no, you're going to be a farmer. This is your only thing, so just accept it. Uh,
Your dad was a blacksmith. You're a blacksmith. That's the way it's going to be. And I think that was part of what um, helped America become what it did early on was that it was for a lot of people it was radical, the idea that you could be something different, that uh, you weren't constrained. That was even a time when just to be a military leader, you either had to be wealthy or have a title of some kind. And just the notion that you could rise to something based on your ability was a foreign concept to most people in the world. And that was kind of what helped sell America to so many people, was that this is a place where you can go and be something that you couldn't otherwise be somewhere else. And that doesn't mean that there aren't still people that are limited by their circumstances, and you can get into all of that. But yeah, we are very blessed in that, if my son wants to go and be an engineer, he can be an engineer. If I want to start a YouTube channel, I can start it. I'm not limited to being what my father was.
Yeah. Well, I think also like the American culture was very like the ideals of like hard work, pragmatism, saving things like that were very unique. I think about I don't know if you've seen the John Adams miniseries on HBO.
Oh yeah, I love it.
That's my
Yep.
favorite historical show of all time. But I think about that scene when he goes to the French court and he's talking about the fact that like I can't go to the music, go to the theater. I have to work hard, and the French are just kind of laughing at him, like, "Work hard? Why? Just goof off, like hang out with us."
So my son can study those things. Yeah.
But we have this in our culture that I know people like to make jokes about Americans being lazy, and sure, some of them are. But really, when you look at our culture as a whole, it's a culture that really values hard work, pragmatism, doing your best job that you can. And I think that's one of the things that has like the reason why the revolution and our subsequent American rise has been so successful is because that those ideals are kind of ingrained within us.
Yeah, and yeah, one of the things I love about history too is studying how people, just by their sheer willpower, overcame something and became something great. People who faced just debilitatingly horrible circumstances in their lives and yet overcame. That's one of the reasons why I connect with a guy like Grant so much. Is Grant was basically good at two things in his life. He was good at being a husband and a father, and he was good at war. And he was horrible at everything else. He tried to be a farmer and failed. He tried to be a salesman and failed. But he had an opportunity. He never gave up. He overcame and did something that none of the other people in that war could get done, which was to beat Robert E. Lee and win the war. And yeah, that force of will helps me really connect with certain people, and I find myself wondering, what would I do in those circumstances? I'd probably give up and try to find something else to do. But certain people who do great things, they never give up.
Well, they say often it's the times that make the man, not the other way around. And it's like in a different circumstance, Grant might not have risen to the occasion. He might have given up or done whatever. But because of the unique circumstances, I think the same for Lincoln too, and the incredible amount of struggle he had to deal with in his personal life and deal with the worst crisis ever. I know that I've been a leader in a much smaller capacity, and I faced like a lot of challenges. And I think about Lincoln being like, okay, well, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to our nation so far. I got to deal with it. My wife is dealing with all this grief, my son. Um, but he rose to the occasion and he just did what he had to do. I think that's very admirable.
Yeah, look at the just presidents, for example. Look at the people that we tend to rank as our greatest presidents. They were typically the ones who faced the greatest challenges and rose to the occasion. Lincoln, FDR, Washington, people like that. Um, you know, Someone like Franklin Pierce, given different circumstances, if he hadn't been in that decade right before the Civil War, if he hadn't had his son die the way he did, who knows? Maybe he would have been just as great a president, and we'd be talking about him right now. But he didn't face those circumstances, or when he did face a tragedy in his life, it got the best of him. And I don't blame him for that. If I saw my son, my only child, die in front of me, I probably would have reacted the same way he did. But yeah, often it's the circumstances and the people who rise to the occasion during those circumstances that we remember as being great.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just brought up John Adams. I was going to bring that up as a separate question. What are some, historical movies or shows that you really love that have gotten history right?
John Adams is a big one. I love John Adams for a couple of reasons. Number one, because he's kind of the forgotten founding father in a lot of ways, or at least he was. People don't realize how important John Adams was to the founding of this country and how much he did, because all they know is he was a one-term president that followed George Washington and signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which was terrible, and got beat by his own vice president for reelection. People don't realize just what that man sacrificed. And so that tells a lot of the story, but it also shows, and I talk about this sometimes on my channel, for a large part, especially in American history, but also world history, a large part of history, women have been sidelined from having kind of the important roles and yet found ways to matter and matter in a big way. And Abigail Adams is a perfect example of that, because without Abigail, there is no John Adams. So much of who he was informed by his wife and her willingness to insert herself into that stuff. And you get to see some of that as Laura Linney played her so well. But you also get to see a lot of his personal story, seeing the son that he had that was an alcoholic and drank himself to death. And going through his daughter having breast cancer and having that horrible surgery that they show in that, and kind of getting those glimpses of life at that time. Yeah, I love John Adams. Band of Brothers is probably my all-time favorite, and I got to go down to where they trained recently, and that was just an amazing experience. And again, Band of Brothers, because it's telling a story we all know, which is World War II, but it told it from that personal ground level. We got to know individual soldiers who really were there, who 30 years ago knew who the heck Dick Winters was. But now everybody talks about him as one of our all-time great heroes in American history. He was a major. There were thousands of majors in the U.S. Army, but now we know his story, a story that most people might not have ever known. So I love those kinds of stories. Lincoln was fantastic. The movie Lincoln, even though it only showed one little tiny sliver of his story, it made him come alive for people maybe in a way that they didn't before. So I really like that one a lot. I think those are three of probably my absolute favorites.
Just like you, I love John Adams. It's probably my favorite series. And I don't know if this part is accurate, but it's a part I really connected to, which is that like he is the forgotten president, and in some ways he's okay with that. Like he makes decisions that are not politically good for him, but maybe he feels are good for the nation. But you can also tell it bothers him that he's not, the hero that Washington and Jefferson are. And speaking of Jefferson, what a completely different perspective that a lot of people don't have. A lot of people see Jefferson as like this really charismatic, great person because he has such a legacy in America. But in reality, he was a very shy, didn't like to talk too much, very introverted person. And the friendship between the two, as strained and complicated as it gets, is really beautiful. Like that last little bit where they're writing letters to each other.
One of my all-time favorite things, and I should preface this by saying I am not a big fan of Thomas Jefferson, just because some of the stuff he did when he was Secretary of State, where and they don't talk about this in John Adams, but he literally put a guy on the government payroll that he specifically hired to undermine the government. He hired him as a translator in the State Department, but then had the guy start a newspaper where he just ripped people like Alexander Hamilton and George Washington to shreds over government policy. But anyway, and then the guy conveniently, right before he's going to testify that Jefferson paid him to do that stuff, conveniently ends up drowned in the river in Virginia in like 3 feet of water. Anyway, that's a story for another day. I might have to do that one on the channel sometime. But yeah, there's a letter, and they show it in John Adams, that Jefferson writes to John Adams after Abigail dies. That's, I think, some of the most beautiful language ever written in American history, where he's just expressing his grief at the loss of Abigail. But then he talks about this, looking forward to this time where they'll have this ecstatic meeting with those we have loved and lost, whom we will still love and never lose again. And every time I read that letter that he wrote to him, it just blows me away, especially because these guys became such bitter enemies. Jefferson was the vice president for John Adams and ran against him for reelection. They tore each other to pieces in the press, became enemies, but then because of Benjamin Rush, who was another one of the founding fathers that people don't really think about too much, kind of get reunited, and then for the rest of their lives write these letters and then die within hours of each other on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Just if you told that story in a movie, people would think you just made it up. And a lot of people did think it was made up in John Adams because it shows them dying at the same time, but they did. And some people say that among John Adams' last words were Thomas Jefferson survives, even though Jefferson had died a few hours before him. But yeah, theirs is one of those all-time kind of cool stories, their connected history that they had.
It's that's politics, right? It divides people, and like someone like Jefferson, who is this whole host of contradictions of like these really great philosophies and these really terrible philosophies that he has, and him trying to like being anti-slavery but still owning slaves and refusing to free them, and all this, and him being a small government advocate. But when the Louisiana Purchase comes around, he's like, well, we need this land, so I'm going to expand the power of the federal government.
Yeah, and being against having a standing army, but being the guy responsible for West Point being a thing, stuff like that. Yeah, like you said, a lot of contradictions, and I think one of the things that we we are a nation anymore, it feels like, of extremes where there's black and white and there's not a lot of nuance in the middle, and we feel like we have to, someone like Jefferson, we have to, or Robert E. Lee is a great example, we have to just talk about them as being this horrible person because they fought for slavery, and we don't seem to be able to find the ability to say, yeah, this guy stood for some horrible things, but there were also some good things about him. Jefferson owned people. He had children, most likely, with his, Sally Hemings, who was the half sister of his wife and was also his slave. But he also did some really great things too. We can talk about both at the same time. We don't have to embrace just one or the other.
Now, I hate that, like, when history becomes politicized, and there's always going to be an element to that because politics dominates everything about our lives. But when we try to paint historical figures in a certain light, whether it's for our cause or against our cause, but that's just not the case, and it's a disservice to actually learning the history to just paint someone as evil or good. The opposite is true too. There's plenty of historical figures who we try to like George Washington. We try to present him as this really great figure. He did some bad things as well, and it's we as historical people who are interested in the subject, we kind of owe it to ourselves to look at the whole picture and not try to make judgments of people who lived under different times and different circumstances. We can take the lessons from their lives, but not try to like put our perspective onto them and be like, why didn't you think the way I think now?
Yeah. And yeah, it makes you wonder what will people say about us 100 years from now and the things that we think are okay now. Yeah, uh, we were talking about favorite TV shows and movies and stuff. I don't know if you've ever seen Turn: Washington's Spies, which was on AMC. So perfect example. It tells the story of, I think there were 4 seasons. It tells the story of Washington's spy network, the Culper spy ring, which helped win the war. And the last episode, the ending of that episode, is a perfect example of what we're talking about, where it talks about um, the the things that kind of don't fit with our view of things, like people that we thought were evil that did some really great things. Like one of the guys who is one of the antagonists throughout the whole show. He's like the most evil character on the show. They tell the story of how he became governor of Canada and freed the slaves in Canada afterwards. And they're like, wait, the guy that we thought was evil that couldn't do a nice thing for anybody became a guy who freed the slaves in Canada. And then they talk about Washington, who was the hero of the revolution. In his first act, when the British left New York City and we reoccupied the city, was to re-enslave a bunch of people who had been freed by the British. And talk about how people aren't just these lily white characters that are heroes, and people aren't just evil. They're all shades of gray, and it's important in studying history to understand all of it and being okay with that.
Well, I was thinking before about, we talked about how a lot of the monarchs were related to each other and everything like that. And I thought about the fact that when you're in power, you are kind of forced to do things that maybe you would like, or maybe you do like, but you're forced to do it anyway. You're forced to fight family members for the sake of power. And that's why the American model, and of course, it's not the only one in the world, but the idea of like limited power, democracy, things like that, I think is such a good thing, because when you're forced to like always be thinking about like, how do I stay in power, how do I get more of it, you find yourself doing really reprehensible things to stay in power. And I can't imagine being in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, in an age of monarchy, anybody who was a threat to your rule had to be gotten rid of. So examples in English history, for example, if you had somebody who got overthrown as king, like a Richard II, you couldn't just leave him in jail, because immediately you throw him in jail, you start having rebellions over people who want to put him back in power. And so then as king, you find yourself thinking, okay, the only thing I can do is kill this guy. It's the only way it's going to stop these rebellions and put an end to it, so that people don't want to come back. Henry VI had to be killed in the same way. He got overthrown, but you can't just throw him in jail. You got to kill him. You're right. It's a time in history when people did evil things in order to, for what they saw as the greater good. Now, we don't have to justify it, but it's important to understand why people did the things they did. Henry VIII, we think of him as this evil guy who executed all these people, but he's also the first generation of monarch in more than 100 years in England that didn't have some significant threat to his rule, some other claimant to power, because there were no more claimants. He was the first guy that was the claimant on both sides of the Wars of the Roses. There was his mother and his father. And so killing people was a way of keeping peace in his realm. Now, he took it to an extreme, but yeah, different time, definitely a different time.
Well, also, I mean, people like to criticize the I don't know the actual word, but the idea that like in England, the firstborn son inherits, and if you're not the firstborn son, you get nothing. And people are like, that's not fair, that's not equal. But the reason they had systems like that was because if you're like, oh, anyone can inherit, guess what? There's going to be war. There's going to be civil wars and people killing
Yeah,
each other for the
you're
throne.
keeping order.
Yeah,
Yep.
so that the system, which is unfair to some people, creates stability. And we see examples throughout history of like people who do bad things, but it creates stability and order in the realm.
And the problem is, again, people are looking at that with a 21st century mindset. Looking at people in the 1600s, it never in a million years would have occurred to them to prefer a woman over a man in a situation. That wasn't even something that computed to them. And today and now England, the rules have changed. And if Prince George's firstborn child is a girl, she's going to inherit the throne, whether he has children after that or not. But that never would have occurred to them even 100 or 200 years ago. So as we evolve as a society, we have to look at those things through the lens of how they saw it, not just through the lens of how we think they should have seen it.
Well, there was Matilda, right? Who almost became.
Yeah, but again, in that situation, it's because there wasn't, Elizabeth I, for example, there was no one else. She didn't have any brothers that were left alive. She inherited after her little brother. So yeah, if was no one else, then okay, we have to have a woman. And funny thing is, in a case like England, who's one of their greatest monarchs of all time, the girl, Henry VIII, everything he did was motivated by having a son, and yet it's his daughter who's remembered as one of the great monarchs in English history.
I really love The Crown as a series because we get to explore, what is it like for someone who is a woman and now is in a man's world, holding this power and having to navigate both trying to assert yourself as your own monarch, but still understanding that like, okay, men still dominate us. I have to kind of play the game a little bit here. I got to flatter some egos. I got to be respectful. And it's just an incredibly complex world to navigate. But yes, like the Elizabeths were able to do that so successfully. Victoria, all these people, and it's an interesting story.
Hmm. Yeah, English history is some of their all-time great monarchs, like you said, Elizabeth II, Victoria, Elizabeth I, all women. But the people in power would never have accepted that that was a possibility, except that they had to.
Yeah, history is full of these things we don't expect them to to be such great rulers, and then they come into it and they do it. Um, not just in like English history too, but like Roman history. We have people like Augustus, who is this sick weakly kid. No one thinks he's ever going to be anything great, and in some ways he was horrible. And by the way, this is just a side note. I'm really waiting for you to do a Historia Civilis reaction. Do you know that channel?
It's coming. Everybody keeps recommending it. Now that after I did the one on Rome a couple weeks ago, everybody keeps telling me it's coming. It's coming.
He's so great. Just these squares, he imparts so much character on them. But anyway, out of nowhere. Yeah, a guy like that who is a sickly, weak guy, not a military guy, which is what Romans really value in their society, creates the Pax Romana, you know, this great time of peace. And he's a horrible person too, does absolutely cruel, monstrous things to people, but he stabilizes everything that his descendants will later, destroy.
Yeah, sometimes those are the most fascinating stories in history, are the people that either weren't supposed to ever get power or come to power and don't seem like they're going to amount to much. Another comparison to that was Alfred the Great of Wessex in England. Um, Another kind of sick, weakly, not a very powerful person in a time when being a great warrior was everything, but uses his mind to become one of the all-time greats and the only English monarch to have the title the Great. Well, there was Canute, but yeah, people like that, people like Harry Truman, who just kind of out of nowhere find themselves in charge of the United States government a couple months after being just another one of the senators and a guy that's very soft spoken. Those are great stories. George the Sixth. One of my favorite monarchs is George the Sixth, a guy who was never even supposed to be king, who has this debilitating stammer at a time when the main power that a monarch had was ability to communicate to his people, and yet I think is one of the greatest monarchs England's ever had. Um, yeah, the unexpected sometimes make for the best stories.
Well, I think there's also something to be said for the fact that, like, when you have this weakness, when you have this thing where you're like constantly put down, you have to develop yourself in a different way, and you get this like cunning or this strength of character that someone who just has everything doesn't really develop. I mean, you brought up Alfred the Great, which I'm thinking now of Vikings.
Yeah, Vikings and The Last Kingdom, if you haven't seen it, is also fantastic.
Yeah, like Ivar the Boneless, and which we don't know everything about him just because the show portrays him that way doesn't mean it was true. But you look at someone like that who was born with this weakness, and as a result develops this like intense, rage and cruelty that he uses as a weapon to do things that other men wouldn't do. And I think that you see that throughout history of like weaklings who develop strength as a result of their weakness, and then go on to do great things.
Yeah, some people, in that situation, like an Ivar, would just skulk away and say, I can never be a great warrior in a culture where warriors are everything, and then just become nothing. Or they can say, okay, I can't do this. What can I do? And they find some other way to be impactful and meaningful. And yeah, sometimes those are the greats, or they develop some other way of doing things that nobody else did.
I want to be respectful of your time. We're coming up on an hour here. Do you have a hard stop or?
Nope, not really. I'm just, whatever works for you for your content is fine. My family's going to grandma's house to swim, so I'm just here alone right now.
Yeah, I mean, I talk history with you all day long. Like this, history is just so fascinating because there's so many like ways to look at it. Like we talked before, you can look at things one way, you could paint someone one way, but someone else have a different perspective. And I think if you're open to hearing their perspective and actually listening to them, you'll just get a much better view of the world.
Yeah, instead of just saying, no, 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 that can't possibly be true. Grant is a perfect example of that for me. If you'd asked me 5 years ago, what do you think of Ulysses S. Grant? Oh, he was a terrible president who just bludgeoned Robert E. Lee to death with superior numbers and material. And then I start reading biographies about the man. And now, if you could pick one person in history that I would want to be best friends with, it's Ulysses S. Grant. And I have just such incredible respect for the man, but also for him as a general and a tactician, because I was willing to say, you know what, maybe I don't know everything. Let me learn about this guy a little bit. And it completely changed my perspective. History allows us to do that. We absorb all the information we can, and then we can make a decision. And we acknowledge that maybe I don't know everything. And I do that all the time on my channel. I say, listen, I don't know everything. You guys that are watching this, I'm the YouTuber that's got 200,000 subscribers or whatever, but you guys know things about the Roman Empire that I'll never know. Teach me. Tell me what you know about this topic so we can all learn together.
Well, we were talking before about like Vikings and a lot of barbarian cultures that we associate one way, or even not barbarians. Maybe they're just like more primitive societies like Native Americans or other groups like that. We tend to put them in one camp. Either they're like bloodthirsty savages, or they're like these peaceful, loving people who everything was perfect until the evil colonists came along. And that's not true either. They had their own conflicts, intertribal conflicts, their own struggles for power. Groups like the Comanches were hated amongst the plains for doing horrible things, but at the same time, they also had this really, respectable warrior culture that they were a part of. And we often try to like simplify them. And one of the fascinating things for me has been learning about like Mongolian history or Hun history. These groups that like we either paint them as like horrible people, and they did do horrible things, but they also facilitated some of the greatest like cross-cultural trade as they moved people across empires. It's the reason we have those spires in Russia, which are Middle Eastern kind of buildings. The Mongols brought that culture with them, and they exchanged all these ideals. So yeah, we can't just look at it one way. That there's good things and bad things about every conquest in the world.
Yeah, I think part of the problem for us in understanding some of those cultures is that they didn't necessarily all leave behind the history for us to understand and know about them as much. We know a lot about the Roman Empire because they left us so much of their history. We know so much about Julius Caesar because he wrote everything down that he did. Understanding the Sioux tribe, for example, the Lakota Sioux out in the Midwest of the United States, they didn't sit down and write a bunch of books telling us their history from 1,000 years ago. So we can only piece together little bits of information. And so then people form their own opinions because we try to fill in the blanks of what we don't know. And we try to think, well, this is the way they were without really understanding the rich history that they probably had.
The advent of world global communication has led to this kind of change in history, rather than in the 1800s it was one group of historians were going out and they would find everything and they would paint the story the way they wanted it, versus now there's really like a consideration of like, let's get multiple perspective. Let's not just paint groups as one way. Let's really try to understand things and explore new ideas that I think has made history just so much more fascinating in the modern era versus hundreds or 200 years ago.
Yeah, I was just, we took a family trip to New England the last couple of weeks, and we visited. They have what used to be called Plymouth Plantation, it's this living history place in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where you could go and see how the Pilgrims lived in the 1620s. Now they call it Plymouth Pawtuxet because they've added uh, a part of living history where they show what the natives were doing at the same time. And it's like you said, there's a better attempt to say, you know what, these were not the only people living here in 1627. There was a whole other group of people who were also living here. And it's important for us to understand their history too. So I love that we are, some people, and listen, I'm probably on the conservative end politically, and some people on my side of things tend to say, it's revisionist history and you're trying to be woke culture and stuff like that. And no, it's trying to understand in that situation that there's more to history than just my history. There were other people living here, and I'd like to know a little something more about them too. And there's nothing wrong with that. And that doesn't have to be controversial in any way for me to want to learn more about their people.
It goes both ways. Like both political sides of the spectrum try to silence the other and be like, this is the version of history that happened. And any contradiction to that is you're either racist, you're bigoted, you're woke, you're whatever, like, slurs they want to throw at each other. But really, I think that the best thing that, like, if you're interested in history, to do is to just try to rise above that. And like we've been harking on back and forth. Don't try to paint people in a certain way, rather than, like, try to understand their perspective, even if they're like evil people. Like, the Nazis are undeniably evil people, a lot of them were, but try to understand their perspective. You don't agree with it, but it's like, if we understand why they thought the way they did, we can stop things like that from happening again. Hitler rose from, the Treaty of Versailles in the First World War. That's when it really starts to, his evil side starts to come out. And understanding that means that we can stop those conditions from happening. And that's what happens at the end of World War II. We don't go back to the Treaty of Versailles. We try to be like, okay, we made a mistake before this happened. Let's not let it happen again. And that comes from understanding people's perspective.
Yeah, I've heard people say things like, "Why did we go in and rebuild Japan right at the end of World War II after we did all?" Because 20 years earlier, look at what they did to Germany and look how that turned out. It was an understanding of history. Listen, we can't punitively just punish these people back into the Stone Age. We're just going to create the situation that's going to bring the next war about. And now look at the relationship we have with a country like Germany or Japan because we didn't make those same mistakes. Yeah, and like you said, understanding that history, um, you don't have to agree with the Nazis to understand why the Germans were willing to give them power because of the situation they were in. They were desperate. They heard somebody say, "Here's an answer to the problem. Here's how I'm going to fix it." And nothing else had worked. So they were willing to take a chance on people that maybe were a little bit nuts, but had a solution that might solve their problem. So they were willing to trust it.
We also were, like, worried about communism. If we punish them, they might turn to communists, and that's one more enemy we had to fight. And again, that's that whole, Cold War era of, like, we won the war, but we know as the war is ending, there's another one on the horizon. These guys who are our allies, we're not going to be friends with them after this, and we're going to have to fight. And it's interesting to me how Japan too, because of the fact that we wanted a strong ally in Asia because China had fallen to communism, they didn't punish Japan for the war crimes they committed during it, which were almost as bad as what Germany did in the Holocaust, like the horrible, like, human experiments they did. Nanking lab, I forgot the number, but the lab that they did human experiments on, and developed bioweapons. That stuff didn't come out to the public because we wanted to build Japan as a strong ally to, fight China with eventually. So yeah, it's funny how politics also informs,
Yeah.
you know, how history unfolds. It's interesting to the, like, how warrior cultures, that's always fascinated me, how they have developed, and how they go into the modern age, because Germany, Prussia, was known as a warrior culture. What did Voltaire say? That Prussia, the Prussian military has a state, not the state. The state doesn't have a military. And Japan was the same way. 1,000 years of Bushido had created this culture where dying in battle was the ultimate honor that you could ever receive.
And you can see how that informed the way that they behaved, like in Okinawa or Saipan and places like that. And it was a very different experience just for American soldiers fighting Japan than it was fighting Germany. I've been listening to Dan Carlin's podcast, Supernova in the East, which is phenomenal, and he really explores a lot of that, a lot of the motivation behind why the Japanese soldiers did the things that they did, even down to some of the war crimes they committed, which were intentional to create a certain expectation for their soldiers and things like that. And it's very fascinating to understand that how they saw things in a very, very different way than we did.
But it's also interesting how the pure militaristic view did not win. It What actually won was cooperation and, like, trade. Trade is so much more efficient than conquering and, like, trying to just steal everything. So that's been fascinating to see in the modern era, how, globalization has led to this idea that, like, we don't need to fight a war to go steal your resources. We can just maybe do some bad things too, maybe force, like, unequal trade treaties and things like that. But it's led to this era of, like, we're cooperating, like the US and China, right? on some level, our enemies are not, they don't see things the same way politically, in terms of power. But the fact that trade is just so much more convenient for both sides has led to this, like, you know, we'll be cool for now. I mean, we'll see how the future develops, but
Yeah, this is a, a pretty long stretch of history without any major conflicts between major world powers. I mean, I don't know when the last time, if ever, there's been this long of a time. And I think what you said has a lot to do with it. There are other ways that we compete with other powers now without having to do it with our military. We still have our military, and we will use it to threaten when possible, but yeah, we find other ways to compete and to try to beat someone else without having to kill people to do it.
Historia Civilis just released a video about peace, and it was the 100-year stretch of peace between the Napoleonic Wars and World War One, which is, it was a 100-year period without great wars, which is wars involving great nations and large scale catastrophes. And in that situation, it also relied upon, communication and trade, like the concert of Europe, and this idea that, like, we have to cooperate and work together to ensure that we don't have a disastrous war again, because we all suffer when that happens.
Yeah. And look at World War One. How that ended up happening was it was a comedy of errors in the failure of diplomacy. And there, one of my all-time favorite reaction series I've done was the one for Extra Histories series on the things that led to World War One there in those days. And that, you look at that, and a lot of people argue, well, World War One was inevitable with the things that were happening in Europe, and that may be, but it didn't have to happen in that moment. And there were so many times where if diplomacy had just gone one little different direction, it all could have been avoided. Um, and the same thing could happen today, but now because we have such instant communication, hopefully we avoid some of those mistakes that we've made in the past.
Well, it was the same way in the when the Russians put missiles in Cuba, and it almost came to the brink of nuclear war. But luckily, rather than World War One, diplomacy worked out, and they communicated. But in that case, it didn't work out well for Russia. They got the short end of the stick when it came to, or Khrushchev in particular, got the short end of the stick. He got peace, but he lost power as a result of it. And it's situations like that that make people think that, like, okay, next time we're not going to cooperate because look what happened to this guy.
Yeah, I'm not going to be Khrushchev. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna go hard and I'm gonna win and I'm gonna get the reward. And oh God, I hope we, I hope we manage to make it. Learning about history kind of makes you worry, because you're like, look at all the times we almost killed each other, like, and wiped everything out over little tiny things that.
And imagine if they'd had the weapons then that we have now. Yeah.
Oh God, like Caesar with nuclear weapons.
Caesar nuking the Germans. He just drop a an atomic bomb on Vercingetorix and be done with it.
Roman history is so fascinating because power is concentrated in the hands of individuals, and they are using that power for their own personal gain. They march on Rome, the capital of their empire, to get more power for myself.
But sell it in such a way that I'm doing this for the good of the Republic, but not really.
God, like 10, 20 years of like fighting each other, and they somehow come out of that stronger than before. Rome is so fast. They should have destroyed themselves. Armies marching and killing each other. It should have torn the empire to shreds, but somehow they survive it to Augustus, to Pax Romana. They come out even stronger, and then eventually collapse from going too far, just having too much territory, not able to control it, and it just falls apart.
And look at that period after, like after Tiberius, where they have all of these absolutely ridiculously bad emperors and somehow survive all of it. I mean, just people that you wonder how. I mean, just because of them being related to the guy before them, that they got into position in the first place. But a great empire, a lot of great empires would not have survived that many terrible leaders in a row, but they did for hundreds of years.
It points out that military power is not as important as, like, stability and unity in like government, because when Hannibal wins Carhai, is that how you pronounce it? He wipes out 25% of Rome's male population. That is insane. Germany loses like 6% of its population over the course of all of World War II. Rome loses it in one battle, 25%. That should have destroyed their state, but they somehow get it together and win. And it's because Carthage did not have the political support behind the war, and eventually Hannibal has to return because they just can't fund it anymore. Whereas Romans were like, we will do anything it takes to win this war, and they're all united. And I think that shows you that like unity and political cohesion beat any kind of like military genius.
Yeah, yeah, you can survive a temporary disaster if you've got the long term support and foundation underneath it. Yeah.
Well, I know we've talked a lot here. It's been so fascinating to discuss history. It's one of my favorite topics with you. Thank you so much for being here, Chris. It was truly an honor. If you guys haven't seen his channel, please check it out. Vlogging Through History. He has some amazing original content on there. And I hope we get a chance to talk again here and talk more about this fascinating subject.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I enjoyed it. There was a lot of fun. I appreciate you taking the time for me. And yeah, let's do it again down the road sometime.
And stay tuned for the next episode of the Pure Kino podcast coming, I don't know when. Thank you. You can listen to the audio version of this podcast on my website, purekino.com.